But I want to remind us why I don't think this is an abstract discussion about Locke or Lockean principles. As you guys know, I don't like abstract philosophy, abstract theology, I got to land the plane, Bubba. And I think these issues are enduringly relevant, literally being played out on our streets. So, for example, initially the revolution in Syria, you could argue, a fight for rights, natural rights, freedom. In Iran, literally going on right now still in the streets of Iran as the mullahs are beating them up and arresting them and killing many of them. Free Iran. And of course, in Hong Kong, where they're waving, God bless them, American flags. There's something like that desire for liberal, democratic principles and institutions. I would argue a desire for something like a Lockean revolution. That's why it matters. It's happening right now. So we can kill those images, guys. You can put those, if you want to close that, that'd be great. I'll close that. Terrific. And we'll just go. Let's get into it. Let's get into it. 50 years ago, in 1969, Cambridge University political scientist John Donne shook the Academy by the collar when he argued that contrary to the secular account of the roots of liberal democracy, the intellectual father of the liberal project was an essentially Christian thinker. This is John Donne. In his book, The Political Thought of John Locke, Donne complained about the absence of any serious treatment of the relationship of John Locke's political philosophy to his religious beliefs. It's an astonishing lacuna, he wrote. I love that word, lacuna. Deficit. Deficit. Donne's work, an exploration of Locke's two treatises of government and its historical context, did much to fill it. And you guys can follow along here in that handout I've given you. Haven't gotten it, please get yourself a handout. Plenty floating around here with some quotations. Well, here's what Donne wrote. Locke saw the rationality of human experience, a rationality which he spent so much of his life in attempting to vindicate, as dependent upon the truths of religion. Locke's entire intellectual enterprise assumed, according to Donne, quote, the axiomatic centrality of the purposes of God. Donne's bracing conclusion about Locke? Locke's overall conceptual approach to human societies and the political ideas which flow from it, quote, is saturated with Christian assumptions. One of the chief targets in the political thought of John Locke is Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, the German Jewish emigre to the United States who helped to revive the study of classical political theory, famous for distinguishing between the explicit and the supposedly hidden meaning of historical texts, Strauss persuaded a generation of political theorists that Locke was really a kind of a closet Hobbesian, skilled at using biblical language to cloak an individualist, anti-religious agenda. To Strauss and his followers, Locke was an enemy of traditional religion who rejected its supernatural claims, its moral precepts, its belief in the immortality of the soul. Listen to Strauss. Some of it's there on your page. Through this shift of emphasis from natural duties or obligations to natural rights, Strauss wrote, the individual, the ego, had become the center and origin of the moral world. Strauss's damning conclusion, Locke is a hedonist. And I want to say with a sinister inflection, a hedonist. Hedonist. The Straussian account of Lockean liberalism as the great solvent of tradition, virtue, and religious belief continues to influence political scientists, educators, and public intellectuals. On the ideological left, on the left now, it has nurtured the progressive assumption that liberal values emerged only as societies became more secular, as they pushed religion to the margin. That's the liberal narrative of the emergence of democracy. But more recently, Strauss, I think, has been enlisted by those on the religious right. They accuse Locke of transforming the classical and Christian ideas of freedom into personal liberation. Dismayed by the materialism and the alienation of modern life, a small but important group of religious conservatives has rejected the liberal democratic project as morally illegitimate. They haven't all completely rejected it, but you hear this language in much of what they say and write, rejecting the liberal democratic project itself as morally illegitimate. Yoram Hazony, author of The Virtue of Nationalism, came out a couple of years ago. He captures the mood of disillusionment, I think, pretty well. He condemns Lockean liberalism now, not just modern liberalism. And they have a great critique, these guys, of modern liberalism, where it's gone off the rails. And I embrace much of their modern critique. But it's Lockean liberalism he's going after, for placing the individual above all other considerations. Listen to Mr. Hosny. It's in your outline. There is nothing in the liberal system that requires you or even encourages you to also adopt a commitment to God, the Bible, family, or nation. Ron Reno, editor of the Catholic Journal, First Things, up the street here, agrees. Locke's ideal society is a free association of individuals unbound by duties that transcend their choices. In Liberty, the God That Failed, Christopher Ferrara, president of the American Catholic Lawyers Association, claims that Locke's vision of liberty is limitless. Listen to Mr. Ferrara. For Locke, as for Hobbes, freedom means the absence of restraint on human action. In Why Liberalism Failed, Catholic political scientist Patrick Deneen portrays Locke as an almost demonic opponent of Christianity and God's moral law. Listen to Deneen. Locke writes that the law works to increase liberty, by which he means our liberation from the constraints of the natural world. Let that phrase hang in the air. Our liberation from the constraints of the natural world. For these critics, the source of nearly all of our modern problems, I'm overstating it now a little bit for dramatic effect, but the source of nearly all of our modern problems, our crass materialism, our militant secularism, our radical individualism, can be traced to the rancid well of Lockean liberalism. Thank you, Snapple, a little public service announcement. Listen to Patrick Deneen. Liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. And he means Lockean liberalism. It was true to itself. But I think the portrait of Locke as a postmodern hedonist has not held up well under scholarly scrutiny. The conservative assault on Locke arrives at a peculiar historical moment. Since the publication of Dunn's political thought of John Locke 50 years ago, we now have decades of Locke scholarship exploring his lifelong religious concerns. Let me explore some of that. In Locke's voluminous writings, including his published and unpublished manuscripts, his notebooks, commonplace books, thousands of personal letters, we encounter a devoted student of the Bible who considered himself, at least, an Orthodox Christian. The historiography, and you have to study it if you're going to do a PhD on Locke, the historiography offers a clear and overwhelming consensus. Locke's defense of individual rights and freedoms was rooted in a profound reverence for the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Let me say it again. Locke's defense of individual rights and freedoms is rooted in a profound reverence, at least, for the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Some examples from the historiography. In God, Locke, and Equality, political theorist Jeremy Waldron, he argues that Locke's religious beliefs anchored his arguments for freedom and equality. Listen to Waldron. Lockean equality is not fit to be taught as a secular doctrine, he says. It's a conception of equality that makes no sense except in the light of a particular account of the relation between man and God. Yale philosopher Nicholas Waltersoff writes that it is misleading at best to try to isolate Locke's religious beliefs from his political philosophy. Listen to Waltersoff. A striking feature of Locke's thought is that religious considerations enter into all parts of his thought. Locke's philosophy as a whole, he says, bids fair to be called a Christian philosophy. In his book, John Locke, historian W.M. Spellman concludes that, quote, the Christian story constituted the core of Locke's main work. In The Mind of John Locke, political theorist Ian Harris rejects the notion that Locke proposed a vision of human freedom untethered by the bonds of community and faith. Listen to Professor Harris. Since God was the source of moral obligation, it is hardly possible, he says, to conceive Locke as concerned with freedom in this respect, freedom unrestrained. In John Locke, Resistance, Religion, and Responsibility, historian John Marshall writes that, quote, Locke's political and religious individualism was not based on social or ethical egoism. Instead, he says, Locke's emphasis on the individual must be seen in moral terms. Listen to Marshall. The responsibility of the individual to study and practice the religion that he thought best and not to accept opinions from custom, education, and party. And lastly, John Locke, in an essay concerning toleration, J.R. Milton and Philip Milton, the Milton brothers, sounds like a 1950s banjo group or something, the Milton brothers, acknowledge that Locke's view of religion is, quote, deeply individualistic in its outlook. They admit it's individual, yeah, but then they go on. It is also profoundly otherworldly. His starting point, the foundation on which everything rests, was that everyone has two destinies, they say. Two destinies, one in this world and the other in the next, they write. Of these, the latter is by far the most important, and religious considerations must take priority over secular ones. I could go on and on and on with the historiography. We don't have time. There is a radical individualism in Locke's work. Let's say that. I almost titled this talk, Two Cheers for Radical Individualism, but that might have caused some of my colleagues here at the King's College to begin foaming at the mouth. Bob Carl foaming at the mouth, not a pretty picture. Thanks for coming, Bob. Locke's individualism is of a kind that we see, I think, in the pages of the Bible, especially in the life and the teachings of Christ. Here is one of the most striking aspects of the ministry of Jesus, his special attention to individuals in need of physical and spiritual healing. Their encounters with Jesus made a deep and lasting impression on the authors of the Gospels, right? We know many of them by name. Jairus, Cleopas, Bartimaeus, Nicodemus, Simon the leper, Simon Peter, Mary Magdalene. What strikes the reader is the engagement of Jesus at a deeply personal, individual level. In every encounter with Jesus, each person is singled out and confronted with a choice. A choice. Everything, it seems, hangs on their decision, a decision that lies within their power to make. Human agency, the dignity of choice, is affirmed at every turn for men and women, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile. By the standards of the day, this is pretty radical stuff, radical individualism. Locke's concept of the individual, of personal responsibility, is framed, I think, by a biblical view of the human condition. And this, I think, helps to explain why his writings became so revolutionary, so compelling, so morally persuasive, that they transformed the debates about liberty and tyranny, faith and fanaticism. Now, we just got to step back and remember the big picture. We can't forget that liberal democracy emerged after the collapse of Christendom. After the collapse of Christendom, the medieval Catholic project, for all of its achievements, and they were quite impressive, for all of its achievements, it failed to uphold one of the most transformative ideas of the Jewish and Christian traditions, the freedom and the dignity of every human soul. And the catastrophic failure of Christendom generated a robustly Christian response, I would argue. John Locke's career, embedded in the Protestant culture of Great Britain, is a central part of that response. And yet, his detractors seem indifferent to this history and the many ways in which the Bible shaped and inspired Locke's political philosophy. My thesis is that Locke stands really in the company of other reformers who returned to the scriptures to confront a cultural crisis. Thinkers like Erasmus of Rotterdam, Martin Luther, Sebastian Castellio, Roger Williams, William Penn. Like no thinker before him, Locke forged an alliance between liberal political theory and the gospel of divine mercy. Let me say that one again. Locke forges this bond, this alliance, between liberal political theory and the gospel of divine mercy. And this partnership, I think, forms the moral core of our democratic tradition. And the recovery and defense of this tradition, I think, is one of the most urgent tasks of our day. Now, a little bit of historical context. Born in 1632, Locke lived during one of the most turbulent periods of English history, the English Civil War, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution. He gets directly involved in campaigns to check the balance, check the rise of absolute power. He resists the attempt to enforce religious orthodoxy by criminalizing religious dissent. He gets involved in all that. Political absolutism and religious authoritarianism, these problems are deeply intertwined in Locke's day. And if you think about it, in our day too, just think Saudi Arabia, political absolutism, religious authoritarianism. And they're backed up, they relied upon eccentric interpretations of the Bible. So what's Locke's aim? His aim is to help instigate a revolution in the theological outlook of political and religious leaders, a revolution that will hopefully give rise to a more just and humane society. So, throughout Locke's writings, he combines several vital ideas: freedom and equality, conscience and consent, reason and revelation. We'll keep coming back to them. They form the conceptual pillars of his political philosophy. Let's start with the two treatises. And get your hand out here, guys. You just read right along. Follow the bouncing ball there. Follow the bouncing Loconte on this, all right? It is here where Locke assaults the idea of the divine right of kings and political absolutism. He defends the equality and freedom of every human being. He makes the case for religious revolution when a government violates the freedom and natural rights of its citizens. So, Locke wrote his two treatises in the 1680s. That's when arguments for absolute monarchy were being drawn from the Bible. And so he meets them on their own terms, these guys. In the first treatise, Locke carefully examines the Hebrew Bible to show no rationale whatsoever for absolute rule. Scripture or reason, I'm sure, do not anywhere say so, notwithstanding the noise of divine right. And he goes on. Locke argues that the Bible could not be used to justify the complete submission of every citizen to an arbitrary sovereign. Reason and revelation, he says, are both on the side of something else, self-government. So the big question then becomes, well, what's the basis for any political authority? If it's not this kind of biblical patriarchal basis, as many were arguing, what's the basis? This is Locke's great objective in the second treatise. And here he enlists the grammar and the authority of Scripture, natural law, and natural rights. Let's read that paragraph together, and I may throw it open for a quick question. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will be consulted that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipresent and infinitely wise maker, all servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not another's, pleasure. Let me throw it open to you guys just for a moment. What phrases jump off the page? It's not a trick question. Yes, sir. Reason, law of nature. Anything else jump off the page? Phrases that jump off the page, leap off the page. Yes?
All servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business.
Yeah. Servants of a sovereign master. Thank you for that. Unlike Hobbes, Locke envisions a state of nature rooted in a fundamental moral law, the protection of human freedom, so that every individual can pursue her divine calling and serve her true sovereign. A legitimate political society, Locke argues, must respect God's relationship with the people he has created. In his wisdom and with his divine power, God calls each person to work out his will in the world. Created, called, sent by him, we belong to God and to no one else. We are his workmanship. Now, why does Locke use the word workmanship? It's an interesting word. Many in Locke's audience in his day would have recognized immediately the New Testament allusion. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 10, for we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Political absolutism, by definition, robs God of his divine prerogative. The agents of Leviathan not only violate God's moral law, the law of nature, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, he says in the second treatise. And so the only government capable of upholding God's moral law, according to Locke, It must be based on the free and voluntary choice of the governed. So in the second treatise, Locke hammers home the doctrine of what? Government by consent of the governed. Government by consent. He hammers it home. Men being by nature free, equal, independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his consent. Polities cannot be founded on anything but the consent of the people, he writes. That which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men. So the social compact for Locke depends on the willingness of individuals to give up a measure of their freedom through an act of consent. Political societies preserve their legitimacy only by fulfilling the purpose for which they were created, the protection of our natural rights and freedoms rooted in the law of nature. So, Locke's political concept of consent is derived from his view of human agency rooted in the Imago Dei. Here is a theological basis for consensual government. Locke's arguments for consent in the formation of political societies parallel his defense of freedom of conscience in matters of religion. Locke believed in what I'm calling the democratic conscience. The democratic conscience, the capacity inherent in every human being to seek, to understand, and to confirm within one's conscience the truths about God necessary for salvation. This view of individual conscience appears throughout Locke's writings, especially in his A Letter Concerning Toleration, which we'll spend some time on now. This is a document, this letter, Locke's letter, that transformed the debate over the nature of religious freedom. Read along. Those things that every man ought sincerely to inquire into himself, and by meditation, study, search, and his own endeavors, attain the knowledge, cannot be looked upon as the peculiar profession of any one sort of men. Everybody's obligated. Locke argues that everyone has the ability and the responsibility to seek after religious truth for himself or herself. We each must yield or consent to the truth as we discover it. Genuine faith, Locke writes, quote, consists in the inward persuasion of the mind, the inward judgment, the thorough conviction and approbation of the mind. We must be fully satisfied, he says, in our own mind about these truths. All the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind, he writes again. And faith is not faith without believing. So why? Why does Locke use this language of persuasion with reference to faith? Inner persuasion. I believe that Locke is making another subtle reference to the Scripture, to a passage in Romans 14:5, which was used by other defenders of religious toleration in his day. Here's the verse. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. What applies to the individual believer applies to the community of believers for Locke. This is not just an individual thing. This now affects churches. Read on. The church is a free and voluntary society. No man by nature is bound unto any particular church or sect, but everyone joins himself voluntarily to that society in which he believes he's found that profession and worship which is truly acceptable. And it goes on. Just as a citizen submits to a political authority based on consent, so the members of a church submits to a religious authority voluntarily by consent. Toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the genuine reason of mankind, it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as not to perceive the necessity and advantage of it in so clear a light. Locke interprets the moral life of Jesus as an unambiguous defense of religious freedom. The gospel story for Locke is a story of redemption that agrees with human reason, confirmed by our moral instincts, the conscience. Read on. If, like the captain of our salvation, they sincerely desired the good of souls, they would tread in the steps and follow the perfect example of the Prince of Peace, who sent out his soldiers to the subduing of nations, gathering in his church, not armed with the sword or other instruments of force, but prepared with the gospel of peace and the exemplary holiness of their conversation. This was his method. And over to you guys just for a moment. Phrases that jump off the page that stand out to you in this paragraph. It's one of those kind of turning points in Locke's letter on toleration. Anything jump off the page? Any phrase. Yes, sir.
Not armed with sword or
And you like that because?
Because it's just such a difference from like the Inquisition of like before and everything. Like heretics they would try and kill before or throw them into prison.
Okay.
And here he's like, that's not what it's here for.
Yep.
They should be prepared with the gospel of peace, not to just shove it down their throats.
Okay. Great, great. Put the sword away. Anything else? Quickly. Anybody else want to weigh in on a phrase that jumps off the page? I'll volunteer one. Captain of our salvation. Captain of our salvation. Why that particular phrase? And I loved it when I figured this out in my academic work there at the King's College, because I thought, I'm going to stick with this. I'm not going to give up on this dissertation just yet. That phrase, friends, it's taken from the New Testament letter of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 10. For it became him for whom all things, by whom are all things, to bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. It was a common metaphor among the preachers of Locke's day, and of course it communicated the image of Jesus as one who would not answer violence with violence, but rather suffered patiently to win salvation for God's people. And then, of course, Prince of Peace, Gospel of Peace, scriptural references emphasizing themes of reconciliation. If Jesus did not use force to win converts, Locke reasons, neither could his followers, whether through the institutions of church or state. Skeptics, heretics, pagans, they must be allowed to go their own way. This is the nature of biblical faith. It must involve our reason, our will, conscience, understanding, and consent, a theological basis for natural rights, the rights of conscience, in a liberal democratic society. Well, one of the challenges facing any modern society, to try to bring this thing to a close here, guys, we're getting close to the close. One of the challenges facing any modern society is the diversity of religious belief. Religious diversity, pluralism. How can societies hold together when their citizens have different views about God and ultimate realities? This is tough to sort out. I think now these basic ideas that Locke has been developing, freedom and equality, conscience and consent, reason and revelation, now they combine toward a political end. Follow along on your outline. But those whose doctrine is peaceable, whose manners are pure and blameless, ought to be upon equal terms with their fellow subjects. So if assemblies, observations, festivals, etc., if all these things ought to be permitted to Presbyterians, Independents, Anabaptists, Arminians, Quakers, others, with the same liberty, if we may openly speak the truth as becomes one man to another, neither pagan, nor Muslim, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion. The gospel commands no such thing. Now, Locke would not tolerate atheists. He would not grant toleration to atheists. You could argue that's an inconsistency in his thought. We'd get into it in the Q&A. He has limits, and the atheists are the limits. But in this Lockean Commonwealth, even the most despised religious minorities would be granted full rights as citizens. Locke would extend political equality and religious freedom, yes, to all Christian groups, as well as to believers of all kinds, as long as they are peaceable, even Muslims. Even Muslims. Think about that statement in 1685 when he actually wrote the letter. Even Muslims. 2 years earlier, 1683, graduates of Loconte Western Civ 2 class might be able to hazard an answer, but I won't even dare ask you for fear of embarrassment. That would be my embarrassment. 2 years earlier, the armies of Christian Europe barely managed to defeat the Muslim Turkish army in Vienna, so anti-Muslim attitudes are at a fever pitch in the 1680s. No matter. According to Locke, every individual, regardless of religious identity, is free to pursue his obligations to God according to the dictates of conscience. And here's the punchline of the whole letter. The sum of all we drive at is that every man enjoy the same rights that are granted to others. That's a little kind of Q language. The sum of all what we're after, what we're really after is what? Impartial justice for all religious believers in the Commonwealth. Friends, is this not the political application of the Golden Rule? The Golden Rule, the very heart of Christian morality. The centuries-long effort under Christendom to achieve spiritual unity through coercion had run its course. It had failed. It was turning lawbreakers and worshipers into hypocrites. And then Locke has some words about that. It's not the diversity of opinions which cannot be avoided, but the refusal of toleration to those that are of different opinions, which might have been granted, that has produced all the bustles and the wars that have been in the Christian world. What's he doing? He's turning Hobbes's Leviathan on its head. On its head. Political absolutism, the suppression of religious dissent that goes with it, is far more likely to produce social disintegration than what Locke calls a just and moderate government. Religious pluralism under a system of equal justice is the key to civic peace and political stability. Locke will go on to argue that the best way to achieve this end is toward the separation of church and state, a position completely at odds with Hobbes, who wants the church to be utterly subservient to the political authority. As we know, it's going to take another century for Locke's insights to be enshrined in a written constitution, 1787 in Philadelphia. And what's the result, friends? Without too much pro-American flag-waving flapdoodle, what do we got? The United States, with no national church and one of the most pluralistic societies on earth, we have achieved a level of justice, equality, and stability that is the envy of the world. What is so impressive to me about Locke is that he rejected the prejudices and the assumptions of his culture, which seemed to contradict the plain teaching of the Bible. He didn't reject all of them, but some of them. There were two great theological obstacles to the ideals of liberal democracy in the 17th century. This is going to be a little bit controversial for this crowd. Two great ideological obstacles. Militant Catholicism, not the more moderate Catholicism that you could find, and also militant Calvinism. There were Calvinists who argued for religious liberty, but not most of them, not in the 17th century, not in Europe. That's going to change, especially when they come to the United States. But these were immensely powerful cultural forces in European society, Catholicism and Calvinism. Unlike the believers in these faith traditions, Locke imagines a political society that protects every person's rights and makes room for people of diverse religious beliefs. So his two treatises on government became a great catalyst, as you know, for revolutionary movements dedicated to human equality, freedom, government by consent of the governed. Locke's letter concerning toleration ranks as the most important defense of religious freedom ever written, a transformational document in the history of the West. Taken together, these works form a part of the canon of the Western democratic tradition. And there was nothing inevitable, friends, about the conversion of European society from despotism to liberal democracy. Nothing inevitable. Many actors played a role in this drama, but few were as consequential as John Locke. How did he succeed? I love asking that question in Western Civ with some of our figures. How did he succeed? Locke's strategy was to reinterpret the Christian faith, to return to an earlier Christian tradition, to leverage the moral authority of Jesus in order to instigate a massive restructuring of political and civic life. Locke was initially attacked as an atheist. One critic compared him to, quote, one of those locusts that arose out of the smoke of the bottomless pit. Words that Loconte can hear ringing in his ears every time he leaves a King's College faculty meeting. There goes that Loconte locust out the door again. All right. Today, Locke is again being attacked as a serpentine tool of the devil to liberate mankind from his obligations to God and neighbor. He's being blamed by the religious right for introducing ideas that have created our current social and spiritual ills. Which ideas exactly? And I put this question as gently as I could to Patrick Deneen during one of his talks at the National Press Club last year. Here's the questions I put to Patrick Deneen, more or less. Is it the idea of human equality and human freedom based on the proposition that every person bears the image of God? Or the idea that the rights of conscience are sacred and can't be coerced by church or state? Or that impartial justice, the golden rule, must be the cornerstone of any democratic society? Or the idea that the desire to find peace with God is inherent in every human soul and that any legitimate state must respect this desire? Are these the dangerous ideas that have shipwrecked our liberal order? No, friends, no. It was these concepts that helped the West to recover its Christian conscience. Leo Strauss displayed, in the words of Ian Harris, the scholar at Cambridge, quote, an encyclopedic inattention to most of Locke's articulated positions. An encyclopedic inattention to most of Locke's articulated positions. That's a polite, scholarly way of saying that Strauss and I think some of his modern critics or disciples have ignored all of the evidence that contradicts, I think, their indefensible conclusions. It's a conceptual mistake of the highest order. After living through decades of political and sectarian strife, after watching friends imprisoned and their lives destroyed, Locke reached his radical conclusions, convictions about freedom and equality, conscience and consent, about reason and revelation that laid the cornerstone for liberal democracy. He's considered a modern thinker, John Locke, but he helped to retrieve one of the gifts of historic Christianity. What gift? A narrative of grace and freedom that can defeat a culture of bigotry, violence, and rage. He reminded us that every human heart whispers its desire for the mansions of the blessed, for a glimpse of that bright kingdom that lies beyond the sea. In all of this, Locke looked to the Bible, to the captain of our salvation. Yes, he looked to Jesus, to the Prince of Peace, to help us to learn to live together in peace with justice. The West could use another John Locke or someone like him in its latest hour of crisis. Thanks for listening.
So thank you, Joe, for that stimulating lecture. I want to begin by acknowledging that Professor Loconte has done us a real service. He's given us a historically informed lecture for us to consider. And in doing so, he has made all of us, especially the students, aware of the nature of academic scholarship. It's in my judgment, by the time students graduate from King's, especially PPE students, they should know something about the nature of scholarly life. The emphasis at King's being on teaching, it's still very important for our students to understand something about how scholarship in the United States works at the level of colleges and universities. I say this because the liberal arts make up so much of our core curriculum. And in view of these considerations, I decided to, when asked by Dr. Loconte to be a respondent today, I agreed to offer some comments in response to the lecture. Now, you have to understand, I'm going to raise questions, I'm going to make some comments, and this is the nature of scholarly discourse. In raising questions and perhaps voicing a criticism or two, it doesn't mean anything except that I might have disagreements with some of Professor Loconte's interpretations, okay? Let me emphasize this point, okay? In assessing the lecture that we just heard, a commentator should, as far as possible, take that lecture on its own terms. We might wonder why Loconte, with his Italian roots, is giving us a lecture on Locke instead of Machiavelli. Right? But that's really it's really an idle question. That's an idle question, okay? And it would be illegitimate for any commentator to criticize Loconte for his enthusiasm towards Locke, for taking Locke so seriously. So what we need to do is ask whether Loconte has interpreted Locke correctly, and whether Locke, as Loconte argues, provides a theoretically strong account of liberal democracy. Those are the two tasks that I'd like to work on today. This is, of course, a short response, about 10, 15 minutes. So I'm just going to try to sketch this, eager to hear Professor Loconte's response as well as comments from you. Let's first consider this matter of interpreting John Locke and then move on to two substantive issues, okay? My comments on these matters will result in a few questions for Professor Loconte to consider and hopefully answer for us, okay? First, in asking whether Loconte has interpreted Locke correctly, we need to recall the division among Locke scholars that Loconte identifies. The division is broadly between those scholars who believe that Locke was sincere in his Christian profession and those who believe he was insincere. This latter group has been associated with the work of Leo Strauss, who lived from 1899 to 1973 and taught many students at the University of Chicago, an impressive number of whom became professors, some of them highly distinguished. As Professor Loconte points out, Strauss's reputation as a scholar of political philosophy is tied up with his theory of esoteric writing. This theory is easy to describe, but not so easy to apply to specific texts. More on that later. Briefly, Strauss argued that for most of European history, great philosophers had to contend with the threat of persecution by state officials and religious authorities, especially when philosophers were challenging some political or theological orthodoxies. In these circumstances, the great philosophers learned to write in a special way. A casual or superficial reading of their book or article or treatise would suggest that the philosopher was affirming all the orthodoxies of his time. But a deeper, more careful reading of the text occasionally, at least sometimes, revealed hidden meanings or messages that challenged different orthodoxies of the day. In their search for the hidden meaning of certain texts, Strauss and his students offered interpretations of philosophic texts, including some works by Locke, that are highly controversial. Loconte refers to the controversy and suggests that a sustained critique of Strauss's interpretation of Locke began 50 years ago with the publication of John Donne's book, The Political Thought of John Locke. Since then, as he points out, other scholars have followed Donne in stressing the centrality of Locke's Christian profession to his work as a political theorist. Recently, however, a new group of scholars has come to accept the Straussian reading of Locke. At least that's what seems to be going on, as Professor Loconte indicated by citing some contemporary authors such as Patrick Deneen, Rusty Reno, and so forth. Loconte regrets this development, and he attributes it to their dissatisfaction with the trajectory of modern life. But the return of the Straussian reading of Locke may rest, at least in part, on new scholarship. And here I want to mention a truly important book written by Professor Arthur Meltzer on the history of esoteric writing in Europe. Published in 2014, the book is called Philosophy Between the Lines. In it, Professor Meltzer presents a massive amount of evidence to show that esoteric writing had a long history in Western Europe and continued to be practiced in Eastern Europe under communism. Now, this is important. Meltzer was not defending esoteric writing as a good thing or the best way to do political philosophy. He was simply affirming it as a historical reality because of the frequency of political or theological persecution. He said the evidence is overwhelming. And the book has been widely praised by reviewers across the political spectrum. This seems to me very significant when you have both conservatives and liberals saying this is significant intellectual history. In view of Meltzer's achievement, we ought to ask Professor Loconte whether he has considered the possibility that some of Locke's most important works may need to be reassessed or reappraised. As Loconte himself reminds us, Locke lived through wars of religion when persecution for religious beliefs was common. Accordingly, Locke might have had good reason to keep some of his views concealed from everyone except the small number of persons who could read between the lines of a philosophic text and discern its true meaning. Again, Loconte takes Locke's Christian profession as sincere, but the followers of Strauss tend to see him either as an agnostic or an atheist who pretended to be a Christian. And Meltzer's book seems to provide more reasons to suppose that Locke may have written esoterically to protect himself. After all, Locke wrote on many different topics in philosophy. He wrote on epistemology, he wrote a book on education. He wrote on many different topics in philosophy, and his arguments for religious liberty and toleration may have been forth mainly to promote the broadest possible intellectual freedom for great thinkers like himself. Notice what I'm saying. The arguments for religious toleration might have been one part of a series of writings, including some esoteric writings, the goal of which was to promote the largest possible intellectual freedom for great thinkers like himself. Could Loconte at least entertain this possibility in view of Meltzer's recent scholarship? That's one question that I would like to hear his answer to when I finish. But suppose that Loconte is correct in arguing that Locke's defense of religious freedom rested on genuine Christian conviction. We still need to think about the adequacy of Locke's defense. Loconte argues that the defense is cogent and should now be seen as a pillar of liberal democracy. I, however, am not so sure. I say this because Locke's defense seems to miss or ignore what has become the central question in contemporary debates about religious freedom. Namely, does religiously motivated conduct that violates general laws deserve to be exempted from the operation of those laws? Let me repeat the question. Does religiously motivated conduct that violates general laws deserve to be exempted from the operation of those laws? To see the importance of this question, consider two examples from our history. In the late 19th century, waves of Catholic immigrants arrived on these shores, with many of them settling here in New York. In church, the children in these communities would be receiving the chalice at the tender age of 8 or 9. But minors are not legally permitted in the United States to consume alcohol. Consequently, these children and their parents needed what is called a conduct-based exemption from this general prohibition. The conduct-based exemption allowed them to receive the chalice. It did not allow them to go to the tavern on Friday night at the age of 9, 10, or 12, okay? Most of these exemptions have historically come from legislatures. But what happens when a legislature fails to grant an exemption or refuses to grant an exemption? In the landmark case, Employment Division versus Smith, decided in 1990, the Supreme Court shocked many Americans by ruling that appellate courts may not grant these exemptions if the legislature failed to do so, and if the laws were truly general and not enacted to harass believers, okay? So the Smith decision says that if a legislature did not give an exemption, courts were not constitutionally required, not even constitutionally permitted, to grant the exemption. In Smith, 2 members of the Native American Church sought an exemption from the state of Oregon's general prohibition against the consumption of peyote. The 2 men argued that an exemption was warranted because consuming peyote is a sacrament in the Native American Church. Smith surprised millions of people because the Supreme Court had previously issued conduct exemptions for religiously motivated conduct. But the court changed its mind in Smith, and Smith remains valid law with far-reaching implications for believers, both Christian and non-Christian. This is a significant problem for religious liberty in the United States, and I am a bit skeptical about Professor Loconte's claim that in the Lockean Commonwealth, even the most despised religious minorities would be granted full rights as citizens. Speaking for myself, I don't think that Locke provides us with the necessary resources to think through and resolve this problem. Locke refers to believers whose doctrine is peaceable and whose manners are pure and blameless, and he argues that they deserve equal treatment before the law. But these days, many secular persons assert that the teachings of Christianity are harmful, not peaceable, and on that basis, they oppose many conduct-based exemptions for Christians. Now, I don't want to criticize Locke too severely for failing to anticipate all the dimensions of a contemporary problem. At the same time, I'm not sure that the intellectual resources that Locke has bequeathed us are sufficient to solve this problem.